Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. Special little episode we've got for you folks tonight, not only by nature of the day that we're dropping this, but also by nature of the fact that we're in the I wish I could pull like an Avengers move and say we're in the end game, but I think anybody who knows anything about Alberta politics, as our guest certainly does, would tell me that, oh, this is so far from being over, that end game wouldn't be the appropriate term. But we are at the end of the year, and so we're going to try to spend the next couple of weeks doing a bit of a wrap up and a what's next, to riff from my favorite television program of all time. To help us navigate that, I am so excited and grateful to welcome to the show the very real and in no way AI version of one of our regular guests, political scientist, Dr. Duane Bratt. Dr. Bratt, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
So happy to be here, Nate.
Um, so, I mean, it's been a year, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And it's been quite a dynamic year. We saw the Rachel Notley, the former premier of Alberta. She just recently announced her resignation as an MLA. We had an NDP leadership race. We had so much crazy happen. We had a UCP AGM. I could go on with a list of like 30 things of wait, what? But that's not my job today. That's
Well, and you say that, but you could also make the case that 2024 was actually quieter than previous years. Think about 2023 and the election. Think about 2022 and the downfall of Jason Kenney and the rise of Daniel Smith. Think about 2020 and 2021 in the midst of COVID. 2024 doesn't look exceptional compared to them. 2019, no, 2019 had its moment. So yeah, this is just the state of play that we are in Alberta politics.
And yet it feels like so much. Like
it does, because it's December and it's been a long year.
Boy,
but yes, there has been. This isn't a government that won an election and is on cruise control. No, this is a government that is eagerly trying to get a lot of stuff done. And an opposition party that's also trying to get stuff done.
In weird ways. I'm still trying to, and I'm going to save that question for later because I want to get your sense of how the opposition's doing, because I have some questions there. But let's get into the list. Because in advance of this conversation, I gave you the heads up that I was going to ask you for your 5 biggest moments in Alberta politics over the last year, and then some other stuff that we'll get to. So what's first thing on your list?
So first of all, I didn't pick a particular event. It may come off as an event, but it's more of a theme.
Okay.
that across. So there may be specific moments in time where we can say, oh, that's the date he's referring to. Yeah, but it actually goes before and after that. And I re-looked at my list because then I was going to put them in order. And I actually got them in order that I wanted right off the bat. So I would say the biggest issue, the biggest theme throughout 2024 in Alberta politics has been the centralization of power within the Alberta government. And you can see this in so many different ways, most notably with Bill 20, which really changed the relationship with municipalities. So it brought in parties for Edmonton and Calgary. It brought in union and corporate donations. It weakened the ability of municipalities to work independently with the federal government. So that kind of symbolized this, but it goes broader than that. You can see the infringement on the Green Line that they have, that the Alberta government has done in Calgary. You can see that with the role of police and photo radar. That's being taken away. And in fact, the former chief of the Edmonton Police is now, the deputy minister of deputy ministers in Edmonton. You can see that with post-secondaries about, again, accessing federal funds independently of the Alberta government. And now we have a yet another review on post-secondary funding led by, of all people, Jack Mintz. And so we see this with the dismantlement of Alberta Health Services, the firing of the AIMCO board. Going promising, but not actually doing anything yet about going after professional regulatory bodies and their ability of disciplining their members. So on almost every file, we're seeing a centralization of power within the government, the likes of which we have not seen before. And they can argue, yes, it's in the Constitution. We can do whatever we want because anything that happens in our province, any structure, is up to the provincial government. Yes, they can. Yes, they have the constitutional power. That doesn't mean it's right. And you have to ask yourself, we've had a lot of conservative governments in the past, some very controlling, and yet they've never taken the steps that the Smith government has.
And I think there's also do you think there's an argument to be made that just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, they could basically annul all municipal governments and say, no longer will you do that. We will appoint administrators from Edmonton accountable to the premier to run the city of Calgary, to run the town of Taber, to run Edmonton, to run every town, village, city in the province. They could do that legally. That doesn't mean it's right. And conservatism used to mean subsidiarity, about letting local matters be held by local officials and decentralization of authority. That's not what we're saying here. So this idea that the Smith government is somehow a conservative government, they are in some respects, but this isn't a conservative value.
I'm curious. I mean, and this is such a bizarre question to ask, but when you list off the things that they could do, that they could centralize all of the power for municipalities in Edmonton and appoint people. Um, what would you give the odds of that happening? Because 8 years ago, I would have said never going to happen. Now I'm like, we don't know.
No, what I could see is, and we've already seen some indications of this, is backseat driving. Right. So look at what the Green Line, look at what Devin Dreeshen publicly said. He goes, this is a take it or leave it offer. And if this council doesn't like it, maybe the next council will like it. So I don't think they would simply annul everybody, but they might pick and choose. And so if their plans for a conservative council in Edmonton or Calgary don't work, and really that's what's driving the party structure, is to put conservatives in office. If that doesn't work, then what do they do? Having said that, I'm not opposed to councillors being fired. I applauded what Rick Montkiver did in Chestermere. I thought that showed a lot of guts. The easiest thing would have been to fire everybody, but that's not what he did. He looked at who the offenders were and got rid of them, but called for elections and let the people vote on that. So I don't think they're just going to go and fire everybody, but they may have that sort of implicit threat. They can pull dollars. There's lots of other tools that they have to try to get their way. The other interesting thing in Dreeshen's comments, which of course was not given at a press conference, but in an exclusive interview with Rick Bell, was this is still the city's project to manage. In other words, we're going to tell them what to do, how to do it, but it's up to them to actually do the job. Because if the province took it over, they would have to wear whatever happened. And that's not what they want. So they don't want the responsibility. They want the power.
Well, and it's an interesting narrative shift because I remember calling by Jason Markusoff, I think, who did it, where he was talking about with the new changes to the Green Line and with the report being implemented that the Green Line was now Danielle Smith's to wear. And I think it's fascinating that, as you point out, Devin Dreeshen went to Rick McIver, was like, no, it's not us. That's
Yeah.
It's interesting. Um, to,
And if it was just about the municipalities, that would be one thing. Because let's be frank here, all provincial governments have had issues with municipalities. Um, because they're seen as a counterweighting force, and particularly the big cities. But as I said, the theme goes well beyond the big cities. I can imagine much of the pushback on Bill 20 came from rural councillors going, wait a minute, this applies to us too? I thought we were just putting the boots to Edmonton and Calgary. Oh, no, they can get rid of us too. They can get rid of our bylaws if they want. And then I think there was some pushback, not enough to change anything in the legislation, but at least they became aware of the situation.
I'm just curious before we move on to your next one, and I mean that is a huge bucket to throw things in the
That's
centralization.
why it's number one, Nate,
Yeah, no, I mean,
because it covers so many different aspects of how our society organizes itself,
yeah.
right? So when we say, well, the Law Society shouldn't be able to sanction lawyers, um, the Alberta Teachers Association shouldn't be able to sanction teachers. Um, that goes further on that these are private regulatory bodies, but the government is saying no, 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 you can't do that. And if it's solely based on Jordan Peterson, that's why I think you have to put this package together. AIMCO, Alberta Health Services, municipalities, professional organizations, universities, anywhere that the government sees a potential threat, a potential counter power base, they want to weaken that.
I think it's funny. I do have a question I want to get about the green line piece, but I think it's so funny that Danielle Smith stood up and said, "Oh, we got to make these changes because of Jordan Peterson, and he's moving to the States." So cool.
Yes, because of the Psychology Society of Ontario, apparently.
Yeah. Um, to be clear, we're recording this on December 18th, but I want to ask you about the Green Line piece because you brought that up in a couple of different places in that bucket. And I'm curious because it seems to me, and maybe I'm being cynical, that would be wildly off brand, but um, yeah, I look at the responses that the province has consistently given to the city of Calgary, and it has always been about the Grand Central Station, the
Yeah.
Union Station. How much of this do you think, speculating, uh, is driven by Danielle Smith really wants trains? Because it's wild to me that we're even still considering this Grand Central Station and the idea of a train to Banff, because the previous iteration of the UCP under Jason Kenney and Prasad Panda said, there's no business case, we're not going to do it. But now we have Danielle Smith, and she's like, oh, we're going to do it, and we need a Grand Central Station.
A Grand Central Station that's not central,
Yeah.
right? No, that's a key point. You look at where Grand Central Station is in New York. You look at Union Station in Toronto, right? Those are downtown, and that's the point. Um, if this is built and you're coming up from the deep south and you get dropped off at the arena and you work downtown, how are you going to make the rest of those 2 kilometers? Well, you're going to get on a bus. Well, I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to drive, which will defeat the ownership, right? So it's not just the idea of a Grand Central Station. It is, they're putting it in the wrong place, right? It would be as if New York said, Grand Central Station, great idea. Let's put it in Queens, right? It just doesn't work that way. And I think that's a problem. I don't know if we could get into the psychology about trains, whether because Daniel Smith's husband's a train aficionado, this is what's driving this. And the other train conversation is one that we've regularly had about a train between Calgary and Edmonton, and there's more and more movement about a train from Banff to the airport. The Banff to airport one, that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm very skeptical about the train from Calgary to Edmonton because this is not the first government to kick around that idea. The issue is, and once again, I refer to the Red Arrow, which is not a train; it's a bus. Um, And if you're going downtown to downtown, it makes really good sense to take red area. You can get a bunch of work done. You don't have to worry about driving. Um, but if you have to go around the city, you're less likely to use that, right? So if they had a downtown train that left from the arena, you're not going to get the ridership to Edmonton that you would. Location matters here. So I don't think it's all about trains, but you have to ask yourself why the fixation on it at the arena, and it's because it's much more expensive. It's the most expensive part of the route to go to downtown. So they're just going to not do that.
I love the I mean you highlighted that Daniel Smith's husband loves trains. There was the whole scandal that came up about him being brought into meetings that he had no business being in, and they do own a train restaurant. But to me, it's just like if we're going to be embracing the evolution of the province, saying we should go to heavy rail, like to me, if we're going to make the argument that we should go to heavy rail to get places, why not horses? Why don't we just go back to horses?
Yeah. No, I think trains have a value. I've gone on the trains in Europe and I've gone on the trains in Japan. And I mean, we don't have the population base here, which is a major challenge. And the LRT is a train. It was once called, Little Ralphie's train back in the fine days. So the fact that they may like the premier and her husband may like trains, I think that's irrelevant. It's a funny little anecdote, but I hope the hell that that's not guiding public policy. I think what is guiding public policy on the Green Line is stuff that I've said before. Look, there's always debates over major infrastructure. There's always going to be a challenge within council, depending on which ward you represent. There's always going to be a challenge between the provincial government, which has the money, and the municipal government that has the responsibility. And you usually need the feds in there to throw some money in as well. All of those conflicts exist. But then you throw in Nenshi as leader of the NDP. And I think that's a major new factor, that because he promoted the Green Line and he's now the leader of the NDP, they want to scuttle it. That's why they call it Nenshi's nightmare. The role of UCP donors on the route design, I think that's not out of the ordinary. They've got their business interests here. They don't portray them as business interests. They just call them good, upstanding citizens worried about proper development. But they have a business interest here. All of that is normal. What is not normal is the partisanship at the provincial level about a municipal infrastructure project. And this isn't going to go away. We're going to have a municipal election in the fall. The Green Line is going to be an election issue, just like it was in 2017.
And all of the other years. Because I remember in 2021, speaking as somebody who may or may not have had some direct involvement with that campaign.
Yeah.
You work very hard to repress that. I do, at least. Uh, that was for sure in the North Central corridor. That was for sure a big conversation piece. Um, we could spend probably a whole hour on the Green Line, but I want to get to point number two.
Yes. Okay. So point number two was the UCP leadership review that Daniel Smith got 91.5% on. And I have to keep telling myself, don't forget the 0.5, because UCP supporters get really mad when I don't mention the 91.5. So 91.5. You could say that was one day, one event, but you have to look at the buildup of that. Very good record, very good turnout, very good result for the premier. But to say that this was preordained, I think is incorrect. She spent a lot of time campaigning for this. And you can't understand a lot of the policy direction of this province without that fixation on the review. So she had a listening tour throughout the province, throughout the summer, went to every UCP constituency. Let's be clear, UCP constituency for her listening tour, because those were the voters. Smith is very good at campaigning to the people that are voting. So she had this listening tour. In some cases, there were leaks that came out of there, and there were certain promises that were made that came out of there. And some of those promises became legislation. So she had to campaign for that. The 91.5 was not a given. It was direct results, including the week before the AGM when she rolled out, her another lawsuit against Trudeau and the anti-trans legislation that she produced. So I would say that the second event was the UCP review that Smith won. Now, subsequent to that, uh, she may have some difficulty because in 2022, she was very good at campaigning to UCP members. It was 100,000 members, and she won that narrowly, but she worked really hard, knowing that a couple months later, she would then have to go to a general population, and she pivoted. A lot of the things she campaigned on in the summer of 2022, um, anti-vax, anti-COVID restrictions, Sovereignty Act, you didn't hear about in the general election in 2023. Instead, the general election was, look how much money I just put into education. Look at all this money I put into healthcare. And day one, we're going to have a big tax cut. And Sovereignty Act, no one wants to talk about the Sovereignty Act. Pensions, no, that's just fear mongering by the NDP. Then she won and she pivoted back. And then in the summer of 2024, with the review, instead of it being 100,000 people or 4.5 million people, it was 6,000. So you have to even narrow that a bit more. And that is what she did. The question is, can she pivot away another time? It worked once. Can she do it another time? We'll have to see. The difference was one occurred within 6 months. The other, she's got a 3-year window. So that's why I would put the UCP review as number two, because it contains a lot of buckets in it.
How important was her, I'm going to call it a ground game in the run up to that leadership review? I mean, you already highlighted that she did the listening tour and the chemtrails. But this to me seems to be a piece that I'm not seeing reflected actively, certainly not to the same scale, by any other political party in the province of Alberta. Danielle Smith made a point of getting to all of the places and doing all of the things and talking to as many people as she possibly could who were on her side.
Yeah,
And that ground game, I think, is in no small part responsible for the fact that roughly 5,000 people showed up to the UCP AGM. It was a record-setting AGM. Uh,
yeah.
why am I missing it? Is the question that I'll start with, or do you think there's a reason why? I look at the by-election that's happening today. Again, recording this on December 18th. And there's three candidates. There are, I believe, 14 or 15 political parties that are registered in the province of Alberta, and only three showed up to a by-election, which is traditionally, if I'm not wrong, sort of the easy one.
Yeah.
Uh, why are we not seeing the ground game from the other parties?
Other party. Really, we're in a two-party system. Yes, I know there are other parties, and I know you've had the Alberta Party leader on, but we're a two-party system. So the question is, where is the other party? Well, they're campaigning in Lethbridge as well. I'm going to save the NDP for later on. I've got some more thoughts on that. So don't jump ahead.
Okay, sorry, I didn't. I just get so excited. Uh,
But what I will also say is, why did she put all this effort into it? Because she knows Alberta politics, right? Conservative premiers don't get tossed out by the electorate unless you're Jim Prentice. Everybody else got pushed out by their own party. She knows that. And she also knows that it's never the progressive, moderate wing of the party that gets angry and tosses you out. It's the much further right party. And so that's why she moved a lot of her policies in that direction, because she knows the history of Alberta politics. And had she not made the steps that she did, does she win? Probably, but at 60%, at 62%, as opposed to 91.5.
I think it's interesting that you point out that the revolts always come from not the more left side of the right, because like we just did a whole very long conversation with two people who were involved in policy development for the UCP AGM, Andrea Willman and Chris Moen. And both of them were very, very clear that their involvement with the UCP is in no small part driven by the fact that they have nowhere else to go. And so I think that the ethos of or the mindset of progressives or less conservatives who are involved in the UCP. I don't know what the term to use.
People who don't like the NDP and feel they have no place to go.
Yeah, that's a different mindset than the black hat gang.
Yeah, you talk about centrists. We're going to form our own party. Yeah, that doesn't work. It may be a great idea, but that's not what energizes people. What energizes people in all parties is on the edges, is on the extremes. That's what mobilizes them. That's what gets clicked. That's what will send money, right? If you look at all the fundraising that all parties do, they're appealing to the angriest part of their party, not the content party. That's the polarization that we see.
Yeah.
And there is a history of parties being formed on the right. Lots of them. Now, the vast majority of them fail. They crash and burn, but they try them again and try them again. But every once in a while, you hit the Wild Rose Party, right? And that becomes successful.
Well, I mean, if you take a look at those like 14 or 15 parties that are registered in the province of Alberta, there's like three that would fall to the left of center, maybe four if you're really, really generous, but all of the rest of those parties exist right of center.
Yeah.
So,
And they all have the word conservative in them.
yeah. Or separatism or
Yeah.
pro.
Yeah.
Number three.
So number three, again, it's a theme. You can't pick a specific date. It's blame Trudeau, right? And so we've invoked the Sovereignty Act again, whatever that is supposed to mean. The Sovereignty Act is toothless, but it does ratchet up the rhetoric, by saying we've invoked the Sovereignty Act. And what does that mean? Well, we're going to sue the federal government. Well, you already had that power, and you're doing that anyway. It just seems more impressive. It's like out of Animal House. We're going to put you on probation. Sir, we're already under probation. We'll put you under double secret probation, because that elevates things. I'm pretty sure double secret probation is not a thing.
Okay, so here's the obvious question then.
And it works because fighting Ottawa has never been a bad thing for a provincial government. And B, Trudeau and especially Stephen Guilbeault keep giving them more and more ammunition. And so as a result of that, blaming Trudeau is very popular. Some of the latest polls I've shown his approval rating is in the teens. I think if they did Alberta, it might be -0. And so this works for Smith. And so anytime she comes into a jam of some sort, you blame Trudeau. The obvious challenge is going to be, and bear in mind, we are taping this on December 18th. By the 24th of December, we may not have Trudeau to kick around anymore. But whether it is December 24th or middle of January or April or October, then what? Then what does she do? That's going to be a longer term challenge. But right now, it's very effective politics to sue the federal government, make all sorts of claims that somehow you're going to ban federal inspectors and arrest them if they show up at an oil facility, or this greenhouse gas emission data is somehow proprietary to the provincial government, and then that's the loophole that they're going to use. None of that is going to work. It's not like this one neat trick to bypass federal jurisdiction. It just doesn't work. If she wanted to bypass federal jurisdiction, she could do what Scott Moe has the tools to do, which would be to nationalize the electricity sector in Alberta or nationalize the oil sector. And she's actually mused about that at various times. Were she to do that, sure, then she could protect Alberta companies.
I'm so intrigued by the proprietary data for the emissions stuff because, like, it was just a few months ago that that report on methane emissions came out, and they were
Yeah.
like, "We used planes and satellites and found all the methane. Look, here it is." And I don't know how, like, are we going to do no-fly zones? Is that what's next? No satellite zones?
So to steal one of my anecdotes I tell in one of my classes, it's around revenue generation for governments. And often the problem is not the tax rate, it's your ability of collecting taxes, which is why developing countries spend a lot more time on tariffs because they're easier to get than income and corporate taxes. So I give the example of Athens, Greece. Athens has an air pollution problem. Athens has all sorts of revenue problems. So they brought in a tax on pools, outdoor pools. Athens is very hot. A lot of people have pools. And they brought the tax in, and there was about 100 pools in the city of Athens that were paying this tax. And then Google Earth comes out, and they were able to identify how many tens of thousands of pools were out there. So yes, there are other tools that you could use to access emissions.
I have to ask this only because you teed me up for it so perfectly, and I will hate myself if I don't ask this question. You don't actually have to answer it if you don't want to. Developing companies rely heavily on tariffs.
Developing countries,
Yeah.
yes.
Is Donald Trump turning the US into a developing country?
So, believe it or not, in that same class, we have spent an awful lot of time on tariffs that we typically don't because of Donald Trump. I am midway through grading final exams, and one of the final exam questions was Trump and trade. And almost every student chose that, given how much interest there is. And I said, and you have to go beyond Canada. And they have. The US percentage of government revenue that comes from tariffs is below 1%. Okay? Most industrialized countries, their revenue comes from taxes. But developing countries, because they don't have that tax collection base, they rely on tariffs, which is why back in the old days, when Britain used gunboat diplomacy, they would seize the custom houses because that's where the money was. So for the US to increase its tariffs from below 1% to replace taxes, which at some point he's mused about, would be going from a couple $100 million to $5 trillion. So, yeah, I'm going to say this on the record. Donald Trump does not understand tariffs.
There we go.
Yeah.
Um, I have a question about Trudeau, and we you
And,
kind of
and save that because we're going to talk
I'm
about it.
going to. I'm going to because it's part of the what's next. Number
We're
four.
only on three.
We're on three, but I want number
Yeah.
four.
Oh, you want to go to four? Okay. Yeah, I think we've said what we can about Trudeau.
Yeah.
So number four is Naheed Nenshi becoming NDP leader and all the things that go with that. So there was a lot of discussion in the early part of 2024 about the leadership race. Would Nenshi run? Would Nenshi not run? Who was going to run? How would that work? He's an outsider, hasn't been a member of a party. Poor Kathleen Ganley, good, solid MLA. She was a good minister. It's nice to have a justice minister who lasted 4 years without scandal, on and on and on. But she gives her launch, and the reporters are all asking about Nenshi, right? And there's a reason they were doing that. You looked at the rules, Nenshi didn't qualify. So they made an amendment to the rules, and that allowed him to run. And then there was a question about, okay, he's allowed to run. How well is he going to do? Well, ask Raki Panchali who saw the writing on the wall very quickly and saw the show of force that the Nenshi campaign had. So she dropped out, and he wins an overwhelming victory, but also built up the party and built up the, I think it was what, 86,000 people, 88,000 people, compared to Rachel Notley, where it wasn't quite, people sitting around a dining room table, but it was pretty close, right? And so it signified, A, that this is now Nenshi's party, B, that we are in a two-party system. Like, this is not some small little party where people are going around, well, you do it. No, you do it. And so I think that was probably the high point for Nenshi. I think he has struggled since then. He's not quite sure what his role is, where he is, some of the issues about going from municipal politics to party politics. He's got a lot of political skills, but he also has a learning curve here. And we've seen a lot of errors and mistakes that happen. But just as with Smith, he's got 3 years to recover and move forward.
I'm curious what you think of the Nenshi dynasty. I don't know if we can call it dynasty because it's been like 6 months, but post-election, because there's been some fascinating choices. I mean, the decision not to run in Lethbridge. I think a lot of people who were watching the Lethbridge situation went, no, Rob will run again for the NDP, Rob Mraiche.
I think it was absolutely the right decision for him not to run in Lethbridge for a lot of reasons, most of which he said. I'm a Calgarian. I want to run in Calgary. I am not going to be the carpetbagger that Daniel Smith was, who lives in High River, works in Edmonton, and is going to go to Brooks Medicine Hat. And she doesn't spend a whole lot of time in Brooks and Medicine Hat. And so I think it was legitimate for him to say that. And then you look at the pure crass politics of this. They already had a candidate, Mraiche, who had run before, but now he was moving into Shannon Phillips' seat. Shannon had supported a different leadership candidate. And there's a much greater risk of going to Lethbridge. Yes, Shannon has won that 3 times in a row. By-elections are a bit different. By-elections on the 18th of December, and bear in mind, we're taping this before we know the results. This is the afternoon of the 18th.
Yep.
So from a very crass political point of view and from more legitimate reasons, it made perfect sense for Nenshi to not go there. Now, he would get attacked by the UCP about he's afraid to go into the legislature. He's afraid of going in front of voters. You don't need to be an opposition party leader in the legislature. And Smith did because she was premier. And the premier has tools of how to get people to give up their seat. So the woman, and my mind has gone blank on her, who resigned in Brooks Medicine Hat, quickly ended up getting appointed in the premier's office, right? And then she doesn't have those sorts of tools, and maybe doesn't want to play that sort of nasty political game. But it was just a hit that they were going to take, and it was an easy shot. But I don't think it meant a whole lot. Where I think his argument starts to weaken is Rachel Notley stepping down in Edmonton Strathcona, because she makes that announcement, and all of a sudden, then she is going, "Yeah, I'm only going to run in Calgary or in Edmonton." When previously it was only I'm going to run in Calgary. Now his argument has changed to say, "Well, I live in Calgary, I'm working in Edmonton, I can serve in Edmonton." Okay, but it looks a bit hypocritical to do that. And why is he, I think, most likely to run in Edmonton Strathcona? Because it is the safest NDP riding in the province. Lisa Young on West of Centre called it Notley's Christmas present to Nenshi. And I agree with that. So I think he will run. He will go in the legislature, and the UCP will criticize him for running in Edmonton and not Calgary.
It was Michaela Glasgow, by the way. I always remember that because of the stories of driving down the country roads and looking at the buried pipelines. That will forever be committed to my memory.
Okay.
Okay, so you think that Nenshi will run in Strathcona.
Yes. Yeah, based on the interviews that I saw with him, where he goes, well, if the party members in Strathcona want me to, I guess I will. And yeah, yeah. Who in the NDP is going to run against the party leader, right?
Well, especially there. And I think that there's
Yeah,
probably something for the folks of Strathcona to say, like, hey, we've had the NDP leader in our constituency for the last like 12 years. We're going to keep that. Thanks so much.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. What's number five, sir?
So number five is Donald Trump. Now, he, you're saying, well, this is a year-end show, right? Well, he was elected in early November, so that gives us 2 months. And he's had such an impact on American politics, Canadian politics, and Alberta politics since his election. We need to put him in there because of the role that Daniel Smith is playing on the actions that Trump is promising. Um, it does not surprise me that Smith seems more in line with Trump than Trudeau. Um, One is number three, blame Trudeau, right? So if you don't like Trudeau and Trump doesn't like Trudeau, then you like each other. But beyond that, um, Trump is anti-COVID vaccine now. He wasn't when he developed it, but he is now. Kind of aligns him nicely with Daniel Smith. He's doesn't like trans people. Lines him quite nicely with Daniel Smith. Um, Believes that climate change is a hoax. Now, Smith hasn't said climate change is a hoax, but I don't think she says the word climate change very often. So on policy areas, she is very aligned with Trump. There are obviously members of her caucus, members of her cabinet, Devin Dreeshen, many of her supporters who love Trump. So Trump is not well liked in Canada. Trump is not well liked in Alberta. Trump is not well liked amongst Alberta conservatives, but amongst the UCP, yeah, he's got his supporters there, right? And so when you look at Trudeau trying to recapture the Team Canada approach that worked quite successfully in 2017 and 2018, where he worked with provincial premiers from Rachel Notley to Doug Ford to Brad Wall, where he worked with Brian Mulroney, Rona Ambrose, James Moore. It really was a Team Canada approach. There is no Team Canada approach now, and Smith is probably the best illustration of that. So when Trump came out with his crazy idea that Trump tariffs are due to the lax border between Canada and the U.S., Daniel Smith said he's right. He's absolutely right, and we have to take steps to protect the Alberta-Montana border. Now, she does say rightly that protecting the Alberta-Montana border was in the mandate letter in 2023 to Mike Ellis, and it was, but it was protecting Alberta from Montana. It was worries about guns and drugs coming from the US into Canada. That's not what Trump is saying. Trump is saying the exact opposite. And that was a fascinating press conference because that's how Smith teed it up and set it up. But when you listen to the questions by the other people that were there, including Mike Ellis, it was all about the threat from the US, not the threat to the US. And that's if you actually believe that tariffs are really about border security between Canada and the US, as opposed to Trump's view that tariffs is a Swiss Army knife that can be used to solve any problem. National defense spending, tariffs. Revenue for the US Treasury, tariffs. Manufacturing jobs in the US, tariffs. Fentanyl, tariffs. I don't like you, tariffs, right? And so Trump has already had a major impact on Alberta. And I think initially Smith believed, and this was at the 10% level, that was before the borders and 25%. I think she believed that she could get an exemption for Alberta because it would rise the price of gasoline in the US. Absolutely, it would. And refineries in the US rely on Canadian oil, and they don't really have access to heavy crude elsewhere. And so she believed that there would be an exemption. I was on a panel at the Canada Club just after Trump's election, where I said they're not going to get an exemption, and here's why. And members of the audience disagreed with me. The other panelists, Deb Yedlin, from the Calgary Chamber, Trevor Toon, the prominent economist, they were also on the other side. They're not on the other side now, when 10% became 25%. And I think Smith has realized he is not going to make an exemption for Alberta or Alberta oil. And by the way, can I just say this, that when she's talking about protecting Alberta from US tariffs, she's only talking about oil and gas. If I was a beef rancher or a canola farmer, I would not be very impressed by how Smith is talking about tariffs, because it only seems to be about one sector of the economy. Now, it's our biggest sector of the economy. It's the most important sector of the economy. But where has she talked about protecting canola and beef and other industries from US tariffs? Maybe I've missed that.
Why do you think it is, going with the Trump piece? Why do you think it is that it seems like the strategy has, to date, has been one of appeasement? Because there's a part of me that looks at the rhetoric that Smith's used. She's said very, very clearly, oh, the United States needs our oil. They need this stuff. And
Yep.
so I wonder, like,
And
given,
she's not wrong there,
yeah,
right?
oh
I
no.
mean, the reason that we trade, like the US is actually independent. They don't need imports, but they do import because they export, and they export to Canada, right? Because it's easier to go from the refineries in the Gulf of Mexico to St. John than a pipeline from Fort McMurray to St. John, for way too many reasons to explain. So we sell back and forth. So she is not wrong on that. I think appeasement might be too strong a word, but the reason that she's in alignment with Trump is, A, she believes in a lot of the same things that Trump does, and B, she hates Trudeau, right? So what was her initial response? Well, if Trudeau got rid of the carbon tax and the emissions cap, that would satisfy Trump. Trump doesn't give a damn about an emissions cap or a carbon tax. In fact, those put extra costs on Alberta producers. If they remove those, Trump would be angry because it would make our product cheaper, which would give us a competitive advantage in the United States. So she's in alignment with Trump on a lot of issues, and she's disalignment with Trudeau on almost everything. So naturally, she is going to go her own route. And some of that route has actually been quite effective. Meeting with the governors, going on US television, talking about the cost to the American economy. Those are all true. Those are all productive. Those are things I told Smith in a conversation with her a couple of weeks ago, that going to the inauguration was a good thing for her. And having the premiers go down to Washington, those are a good thing. But she's got her own motivations here that are separate from the arguments that she's making. So she's done a lot of good things, not so much on some others.
I just like, for me, it feels like, given how Donald Trump has conducted business in the past, which I think you have to kind of take in context, there's to just roll over and say, "Let me show you my belly," is not a position that's going to get a particular amount of respect from him. And I feel like there's a certain, um, I wonder why, and this is where I'm gonna, hopefully you're gonna tell me why I'm wrong, but I wonder why it is that, as Danielle Smith leads into the sheriff rhetoric and the Western rhetoric, she's not pulling a little bit from Shane and saying, "Hey, you know what? If you want to do this, pick up the gun and
Yeah,
let's see where this goes." But she's not doing any of that. It's just like, no, we can't make him angry because we can't make him angry.
yeah. Um, you can't trust this guy. Ask any subcontractor in New York City in the 1980s. We have a trade agreement with the United States. He cannot impose 25% tariffs or 10% tariffs. What he is going to have to do is declare it a national security risk or a national emergency, like he did when he used steel and aluminum tariffs, right? There is no clause. Unlike Pierre Poilievre is convinced that there's some clause that Trudeau negotiated with Trump that allows Trump to do that. That's hogwash. What he is going to have to do is claim a national emergency, and that's why he's putting tariffs on that. But protecting the border is a good thing in both directions. It's a good thing. I don't want to see guns flowing across. I don't want immigration or drugs or any of that. It's a good, positive thing. But that's not what Trump is using tariffs for. He's concerned about drugs and people from Mexico. He's concerned. He keeps saying we subsidize Alberta or Canada to the tune of $100 billion a year because that's the trade deficit. No, the trade deficit is because Americans are buying an extra $100 billion worth of goods from Canada. I have a trade deficit with Co-op. They don't buy any of my stuff. I seem to buy a lot of their stuff. So it's unfair. So if you take the approach that if we solve the border, and again, solving the border is a good issue, that's not going to solve us with tariffs. You cannot trust a word that comes out of this man's mouth. Contracts are irrelevant. Treaties are irrelevant. Norms are irrelevant. The law is irrelevant. So I don't know. Are they playing different strategies? Is Doug Ford coordinating with Smith, on a good cop, bad cop? Or more likely, are they just doing their own thing? And I think that's more likely because there is a power vacuum in Ottawa. And it's not just Smith who doesn't like Trudeau. The opposition parties don't like Trudeau. Members of his own party don't like Trudeau. The Canadian public doesn't seem to like Trudeau. And so he can't galvanize people. The question is, if Trudeau leaves, will we then see a unified approach from Canada? Because in dealing with the Americans, that's the only thing that works. We are in a power imbalance with them, and we need to work together, and we need to use every lever and every negotiating tool at our disposal. Smith is absolutely correct that a trade war benefits nobody. He puts tariffs on us. We put tariffs on him. It's like, you're going to shoot us in the foot. We'll shoot ourselves in the foot too. Like, she's not wrong there. But the question is, what other options, what other deals exist?
Do you think, and this is one of the frustrations that I've experienced over this whole conversation, do you think that sort of um, giving all of his claims credence is a mistake? Because I watched the press conference with Danielle Smith where she was like, "Oh, the migrants, we got to stop the migrants." And then one of the reporters asked, "Hey, Mike Ellis, how many migrants are there?" And he was
And he
like,
couldn't come up with any.
"Well, maybe Kevin J. Johnson, but that was a few years ago. So what are you going to do?" Uh, he couldn't come up with one. And then I saw Vashi Capellos in her interview with Danielle Smith be like, "Are we blowing this out of proportion?" And Smith's response was like, "Well, it doesn't matter. We can't possibly blow it out of proportion because we've got problems no matter what." And on the flip side, I look at and I'm still like, I really want to be wrong about this because it seems like such a unnecessary mistake to make. But the comments that we saw from NDP leader Head Nenshi, where he was like, "Yeah, they caught 44 pounds of fentanyl at the Montana-Alberta border," and everything that we've been able to find over here says, no, that was 44 pounds over the entire year, over the entire border. And
Yeah.
like that is just
And then the response back from the UCP is, well, it's 2 milligrams is all it takes to kill somebody, right? And so, okay,
I
so
mean,
we
2
have to
milligrams
get
is
to
a lot.
zero. What steps do we take to get to zero, right? And so it's not about the border. That's just the issue du jour, right? There's so many other things at play here. But the problem is you have to take him seriously. You have to plan for that. I think we have to stop getting over, oh, he wants to annex Canada because he's joking about a 51st state. But every time he says that, it riles up Canadians. So what does the bully do? Oh, if I call you that name, um, I'm just going to keep using it because it makes you mad. He's a bully. And on the immigration, I'm not sure about Alberta, but Canada is going to be hit badly with illegal immigration coming from the United States. In 2017 and 2018, we were hit with about 50 or 60,000 people fleeing the US into Canada, largely through Roxham Road, a bit through Manitoba, some through Ontario. If he actually begins mass deportations, you're going to see a flood, and 50,000 becomes 500,000. And we are totally unprepared for that. So, yes, there is a border issue, but not the one that Donald Trump is talking about. And he would actually call that a win. If people were fleeing US into Canada, he would call that a win.
See, now that to me is an interesting argument that I wonder why we haven't heard Danielle Smith or Ned Nenshi
Mike
talk.
Ellis has made that,
Has he?
not about people. Jason Kenney has about um, but Ellis has been talking about guns and human traffickers and things like that, but not the real threat of extreme mass deportation. And everything that Trump is doing in his nominations is setting the stage for that. I don't know if it's logistically possible because you would have to have some sort of internment camps before you could do the deportations. And the Americans put a lot of people in prison. Last I heard, it's around 2.5 million people are incarcerated. Well, they would need to build another set of prisons for 2.5 million people or 5 million people, and that's just impossible. But we have to take it seriously because it was just a comment about a Muslim ban that led people to come into Canada.
I just wonder why no one's framing the argument the way that you just did and saying if Donald Trump goes full fascist and the Americans aren't able to stop him and he starts putting people in internment camps and forcing them out of the country, yeah, we're going to have an illegal migrant problem. So I just don't understand why we're not
That
talking.
we've never had. So
Yes.
to say, well, it's because Trudeau's an idiot and he's unprepared. There's a reason we've had the longest undefended border. We've never needed to. Yes, there was this influx in 2017 and 2018. We didn't see that influx before 2016. We didn't see it after 2020. So is that Trudeau or is that Trump? And we saw draft dodgers in the 1960s and the United Empire Loyalists, in the 1700s. Those have been about the only times. And so Canada has been lax because we've had the luxury of being lax. Why spend money to harden the border along Alberta and Montana that nobody's crossing?
Those are your five things. So we got the centralization of power, we got the UCP leadership review, we've got Trudeau, we've got Ned Nenshi, we've got Donald Trump. What are the things? I mean, obviously, the Donald Trump is going to be something that you're watching going
Yeah,
forward based on literally the last 15 minutes of our conversation.
yeah.
But what are some of the other things that you're going to be watching as we head into 2025?
I think the other is what happens when Trudeau is not there. How does the provincial government, and that will happen in 2025. I don't know when, but it will happen in 2025 unless somehow Trudeau not only doesn't resign, but wins a government. That's not going to happen. I think even if Donald Trump came out today or tomorrow and publicly endorsed Pierre Poilievre, that still wouldn't help Trudeau enough. Trudeau is going down, whether it's by the voters, himself, his own party. Okay. Then what does she do? So you look at things like the pensions. I don't think there'll be a press conference where Danielle Smith gets up and goes, "We're abandoning the Alberta pension plan." It'll be kind of one of those things. Do you remember we used to talk about pensions a lot? Why aren't we talking about that now? And But there will be moments of strife between a Poilievre government and a Smith government. And how does that get handled? How does that get framed? Or even in the absence of that, fighting Trudeau covers up a lot of other errors that Smith has. The public may not be happy about the centralization of authority or punching down on trans people, but they hate Trudeau, so that covers it up. Even if she's not working in harmony with Poilievre, she doesn't have that person to kick around. Maybe Donald Trump could take that role, except we've just spent all this time talking about how much in alignment Smith is with Trump. So finding that external enemy, which has been the tradition in this country, in this province, that's going to be tough. So I think what happens when Trudeau's not around?
I'm curious, and I know that, and I resent the niche um categorization that the anti-trans policies have gotten. I'm curious what you make of her comments on the 14th because she has, I mean, very, very early on in the conversation, I guess, on her announcement of the trans policies, which were almost exactly a year ago because they came out at the beginning of
Yeah,
January. The question was, okay, but will you use the notwithstanding clause? And she kind of hemmed and hawed, and she said, "Oh, we'll totally use it on forced treatment." Uh,
yeah.
but in regards to the trans piece, she waffled a little bit. And she stopped that waffling on Saturday, December 14th, when she said that she would absolutely, her word, absolutely would use the notwithstanding clause if the courts deem these policies to be illegal and a violation of the Charter and rights and freedoms. How big, like, I struggle with this one so much because it doesn't get the attention that I believe that it's due because the reality of Danielle Smith invoking the notwithstanding clause to force these policies through is Danielle Smith, the libertarian who rode into power saying Kenny violated the charter, they all violated our rights and freedoms. Oh, it was just the worst, the worst, the worst with the COVID restrictions, and I couldn't go to my neighborhood Boston Pizza or whatever. For her to turn around and go, I'm going to use the one mechanism that allows me to violate human rights for a period of 5 years. That to me is so big. Um,
And I think the reason it's not being discussed is it hasn't happened. It's one thing about suggesting you would in that eventuality. It's another when you actually pull the trigger on that. Alberta has not used Section 33 before. We've threatened, we've come very close, we've announced it and backtracked, but we haven't used it. And thank God, unlike Saskatchewan, they did not preemptively use it, right? Imagine that, where you're saying, we know this is wrong. We don't need to wait for the courts. We already know this. That's even worse. The problem, and we're seeing this in the larger discussion around the notwithstanding clause, is once it's used, it's easier to use it again. And it's easier to use it again. The federal government has never used it. The Quebec government uses it a lot. Doug Ford and Scott Moe have started to use it a lot more preemptively instead of after the fact. In some cases, on stuff they didn't even need to do. I think of Doug Ford using the notwithstanding clause over amalgamating wards in Toronto. Really? That's clearly in your jurisdiction. So once you use it, and there are people close to Smith who want to use the notwithstanding clause on almost every issue. And so I'm very curious what the response will be of Albertans if that actually happens, because it would be in a response to a court decision saying you're violating the rights of people in these ways. And the government is going to say, we don't care, we're going to do this. All of the COVID restrictions were challenged in court. They didn't need to use Section 33. They used Section 1. And Section 1, in a free and democratic society, some rights can be infringed. That held up consistently. But they can't use Section 1 with the anti-trans legislation because I don't think it is proportional. I don't think it's an immediate threat. It would not withstand the Oakes test to get through.
well, it's not evidence based. It blows my mind that Daniel Smith can stand up in the face of the Alberta Medical Association, the Canadian Medical Association, like
Well,
all of
doctors are wrong sometimes, but not the government, or that this is about parental rights unless you're the parent of a trans youth.
that got really Orwellian really quick.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that got super.
So that may be something that happens in 2025, but let's see what the legal challenges are and if they actually go ahead and do it.
Is there anything else that you're watching for in 2025?
So once, if Nenshi does run in Strathcona, he does get in the legislature, how does that change the narrative, both in the legislature and outside the legislature? Um, it is tough being an opposition leader. And unless, Pierre Poilievre, I think, enjoys being opposition leader. He gets to have a lot of fun and one-liners. Is that what we're going to expect, from a man like Nenshi who talks about having a bit more depth? I'm not sure that works there. We'll have to see. And he's struggled since winning the leadership. So does he start to get his feet under him as leader?
Okay. Um, I'm curious. The other question that I had, if you don't mind doing a little bit of prognosticating, um, Trudeau, my sense, yeah, he did not, and in the face of everything that happened, like what was it, yesterday or the day before, he did not come out and say, you know what, I've had my walk in the snow. Everybody likes to go with that because that's what his dad did. He did not. He attended a liberal fundraiser and he spoke with fire. Some have argued that he was actually making some pointed references to the resignation letter from his finance minister. Um, I don't think he's going to go before New Year's. Who do you see though that could be a, replacement? What's the field look like right now?
So if I wanted to become liberal leader, I don't think I want to be the liberal leader after Justin Trudeau. I think I want to be the next liberal leader because um, the liberals are going to get trounced no matter who is at front. The difference is Trudeau may take them down to 25 seats. A new leader may keep them at 40. Um, but if they go from 170 to 40, they're going to blame it on that leader, even though the leader could say, well, it could have been 20, but it wasn't 20, it was 40. Um, I the people, I think Freeland is going to run. And she's not a good public speaker. I think Freeland is smart. I think she was effective in a number of portfolios, except for finance. She can write, but she doesn't speak well. And that is a debilitating weakness in a of any political leader because much of your job is leading. And prior to Monday, her biggest weakness was she was too closely tied to Trudeau. Well, not so much now. Not so much now. I mean, the others are Philip Champagne, Anita Anand. We keep hearing Mark Carney from outside. Um, those are the people on the list. But that's the challenge because Trudeau has really made it his party, and I think there are some capable people in there, but it's going to be tough for them to overcome that. The other interesting thing is the Liberal Party, I believe, since its inception, has always alternated between a French and an English-speaking leader. And does that mean it's a Carney or an And or a Freeland and not a Champagne or a Jolie? And what does that do in Quebec? Because the times that the Liberal Party has done worse in Quebec is when they've had an Anglophone leader, Michael Ignatieff, John Turner, etc. So maybe the Liberal Party has changed. There's a lot of dynamics there, but there has been no succession planning.
Yeah.
Just as I don't believe there was a whole set of succession planning when Harper left, and that's why they've cycled through so many different leaders until they got to Poilievre. And I will also say Poilievre will win. He'll win a large majority government, possibly one of the largest in Canadian history, and he will have a very short honeymoon because it's not a vote for Poilievre, it's a vote against Trudeau. And Poilievre has been in politics a long time, and he's been an attack dog. And you can do that when you're the opposition. You can do that when you're a junior minister. Someone in the government has to play that role back. And he did that for Harper. It's tough to be the attack dog when you're the prime minister of the country. And axing the tax, that's going to be really easy. You can do that. That's going to be really popular. What does he replace it with? I don't think he's going to replace it with anything. But the rest of the stuff, build the homes. Federal government can't do that unilaterally. Stop the crime. I don't think ending bail is going to solve that. Fix the budget. Let's see. He's going to have some challenges, and when he goes and decides he's going to get rid of the CBC, and then people realize a lot of people listen to CBC radio, a lot of rural constituents, that's their only radio station. Radio Canada remains very popular in Quebec. He would have to change the Broadcasting Act to eliminate English TV, because really that's what it's about, is English language television. That's going to be tough for him to do. It's popular in his rallies, but can he do it? And how does he negotiate with Trump? Now, Trudeau was a relatively new prime minister when he had to negotiate with Trump, but he took advice from right across the political spectrum, including bringing Brian Mulroney into his cabinet meeting. I think John Turner was rolling in his grave when he saw that happening. Poilievre doesn't sound like he's going to reach out. Hey, Christia, what was it like negotiating with Trump and Lighthizer back in 2018? Can you give us some advice? I can't see Poilievre doing that. So I don't know what his negotiating strategy will be. He's been pretty silent on this Trump thing, noticeably silent.
I wonder, like, I go back to the paper that, I mean, you referenced Dr. Trevor Toome earlier. I go back to the paper that he did where the cost of the things has only gone up by, I think it was 0.8% because of the carbon tax.
That's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. People believe
Oh, I
that
know.
the carbon tax is so high.
But that's where I wonder, like, Poilievre comes in and he axes the tax and haha.
And nothing changes.
Exactly.
Yeah. But inflation is going to be dropping anyway. We're already seeing inflation dropping, right? And so he will say, I axe the tax, inflation is dropping. Those are two separate things that are happening simultaneously, but that's how politics works.
And I don't expect that we're going to see, I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't expect that we're going to see a negative inflation rate. Like it's
No,
not as bad, but nothing's going to
no,
get
prices aren't going to go back to where they were
Yeah.
in 2020.
Yeah. Anything else you want to throw out there, Dr. Bratt? You've been very generous with your time.
That's a lot, and it's only because I'm procrastinating from grading.
Well, I would do the same thing
Yeah.
if I was in your shoes. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. I always enjoy our conversations. I always appreciate your patience with me. So thank you very much. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, all of those good things to you and yours. And
Yeah.
I imagine you'll be hearing from us with more interview requests in the new year.
Okay, not in December.
No. All right. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, see you then.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case, maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.